Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know our time is valuable. We're all trying to juggle a lot of things, so we really always appreciate when you choose to spend your time here. And we really aim to give you some great value to make sure that it's worthwhile. And today, I am quite sure you are going to find that value. We're going to be chatting today with Dr. Gary Sprouse and talking about negotiating past stress on your road to happiness and how that helps you show up better in negotiating the rest of your life. So, welcome, Gary. It's so great to have you here.
It's so awesome to be here. Thank you so much.
And for those of you who may not know him, Dr. Gary Sprouse, sometimes known as the Less Stress
That's it,
Doc,
man.
which I
Yeah, get
love.
that in there.
He's been a respected and sought after primary care physician for over 30 years now. He's a member of the American Medical Association, Mensa, the president of the Queen Anne's Medical Society, and he spent over 2 decades researching better ways to heal both the mind and the body. And that led him to write his book, which is called Highway to Your Happy Place, a roadmap to less stress. So we could all use a fair bit of that. So why don't
Mm.
we jump right in, Gary, to the stress piece? I mean, we live in a stressful world today, or at least it feels that way, I think, to people. What are some of the leading causes of stress, would you say?
Well, so here's what I find. The biggest leading cause is we don't even know what we're dealing with. So when I say to my patients, like they come in and they say, Dr. Sprouse, I worry that I worry too much. And I go, yeah, well, then you probably do, right? But then I say to them, so tell me what worry is. And they get this look like, yeah, I got this. I can use it in this sentence. I know what it feels like. But then when they go to define it, it's like, whoa, it gets really hard. And then I say, well, if that's your
Yeah.
definition, they come up with something. I go,
Yeah.
if that's your definition, how would you fix that? Well, it's unfixable. So the first thing to do is realize, and I think you've said this before, like
Yeah.
I can't necessarily stop what happens to me,
Yes.
but I can change how I react to it. But
Yeah.
the only way you can change how you react to it is know what you're doing. So when
Yeah.
I define worry for them, then they go, oh, and then I say, okay, so now with my definition, so here's my definition, is I'm using my amazing human skill of being able to envision the future. I focus on all the bad things that can happen. And then I have a fear reaction like right now.
Yeah.
So if that's your definition of worry, well, now you can do something about it. And so that's first step, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. Now,
Yeah, it works out.
yeah. I often say, and I'm sure you heard me saying that negotiating our mindset's key on the road to dealing with those roadblocks to find happiness. So let's start with what, like just tying in, following up on what you were saying. What are some of the sort of ways that we can take control back about how we react to things
Yeah.
in life?
So let's just stay with worry, right? So if you're in a negotiation and you start worrying about it and all you're doing is focusing on all the bad things that can come out of that, well, that's not going to make you go very well because fear literally hijacks our
Yeah.
brain. Like
Yeah.
it says, there's a part of our brain that's cognitive and thinking and problem solving, and there's another part of our brain that's fear.
Yeah.
And when fear takes over, like the cognitive part of your brain doesn't work as well. So when
Yeah.
you're afraid, it makes it harder. So worry really is a big fear reaction.
Yeah.
And so the more fear you have, the less you can think. So that's not going to help you in your negotiation. So
Yeah.
there's two things that I talk about in ways to reduce. So here's what the first thing I say is, I don't want you to stop worrying. Like worry is really important. It's what made us so great as an organism because we can envision the future and then not do that or
Yeah.
do that, whatever, right? So it gives us this incredible step up.
Yeah.
But what I do tell people is there's a way to envision the future and not have a fear reaction.
Yeah.
Okay. So the two things I talk about first is realistic optimism. So that means, so I have choice, right? So I can go, hey, I'm going to focus on a bad thing that's going to happen, or I could focus on a good thing that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So which is better, right? So I use myself when I was writing my book. I could sit there and go, the book's never going to get done. Even if it does, it's never going to get published. And even if it does, it's nobody's going to buy it. And even if they buy it, it's not going to get better. Well, right. That makes you feel bad, right? And so then
Yeah.
you never finish the book.
Yeah.
But my realistic optimism, I go, oh, hey, this book is going to be awesome when it gets done, and people are going to love it, and they're going to be better, and the world is going to be a better place. Yay, right? That makes you feel good. And so then you want to write it. So the optimism part is like you want to focus on the good things that can happen. But the
Yeah.
realism part is, well, you can't ignore that bad things can happen because
Sure.
that gets you into just as much trouble. So the
Yeah.
realism part is, oh yeah, well, most authors don't don't sell very many books. So I'm not quitting my day job as a doctor yet, right?
Yeah.
So, and this brings me to the second tool, which is, all right, well, how can I look at the bad things that could happen and not have that fear reaction?
Yeah.
So I made up this thing called a worry organizer. And the worry organizer is this 5 columns. and it sets up your worry. And it does two things. First off, you have to write it down, and writing it down now leaves you to problem solve as opposed to trying to remember what it is you're supposed to
Yeah.
worry about. And it says, like, what am I worried about? So, like, I had a patient who was worried about breast cancer.
Yeah.
And so the second column was, well, why are you worried about getting breast cancer? Well, her mom and her sister both had breast cancer.
Yeah.
So then the third column is, well, how likely is it to happen, and how bad is it if it happens? And this is where I was able to help her. So she
Yeah.
came in, and when she filled out that column, she said, well, it's a 100% chance I'm going to get breast cancer and a 100% chance I'm going to die from it.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, right. Yeah, see?
Yeah.
And I looked at her, and I said, well, basically you just said you're going to die.
Yeah.
And so what we were able to do then is like, wait, so she was able to show this to me and tell me what she was thinking. And
Yeah.
I gave her the real statistics were, it's only a 15% chance you get breast cancer if you have a family
Yeah.
history. And there's an 85% chance that you'll survive.
Yeah.
And you could see her body change, her
Yeah.
body, like all of a sudden she got her life back. And you're
Yeah.
like, yeah. So then the next column is like, well, what can I do to make it not happen? So she can get mammograms and get her blood
Yeah.
tested and should do self exams, blah, blah. And then the last column is, well, what do I do if it happens? So what
Yeah.
happens if I get breast cancer? What do I do? And what I find is when people plan for those worst things, then they don't
Yes.
have to be afraid anymore. Because the more
Yeah.
they have it planned out, then they don't have to be afraid.
Yeah. I love that. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I have to do this thing with my clients. I call it the worry dump or whatever, where you're just at least getting it out. But yours is much more sophisticated. I love that. I'm definitely going to share that. And I was laughing when you were talking about the optimistic part, not laughing at what you were saying, but it was resonated with me because, oh my gosh, it sounded like me talking to my kids when they give such disempowering stories they tell themselves. And I'm like, think about the story that you're telling yourself and training your brain. Does that serve you? You know, like, what's a better story maybe you want to tell you? And they're like, huh?
Yeah, right. Well, you talked about limiting ideas and limiting beliefs. Yeah, for sure. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I also found, like, I don't know if you know how much about Tony Robbins, but he talks about transformational vocabulary.
Yeah.
And it's really critical. So I'm talking to my friends like, yeah, my back is killing me. And my husband's an ogre. And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Like, how about we tone those words down a little bit?
Yeah.
Maybe that won't be so bad, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Flip the story. Flip the story we're telling yourself. Now, overwhelm, it's sort of tied to what you were saying about that stress reaction piece. I mean, we hear recurring complaints today about, overwhelm leading to everybody's stress. So I know you've got some secrets about how to escape that sort of dark hole, if you will. Tell us a bit about that.
No. Well, so here's the problem that humans get into. And this is one of the themes in my book, which is we have these amazing human skills. So we can envision the future. We have all this technology. We have words. We have all these great things. But all our skills, so I'm a doctor, right? So I'm used to a medicine has great benefits, but it can also have some side effects. So I give you this medicine for your blood pressure, and it can make your blood pressure go down and keep you from having a heart attack. Oh, but it might make you feel a little dizzy or whatever, right? So when I looked at our human skills, I was like, oh, this is the thing. Like, we have these great skills, but they come with side effects.
Oh, yeah.
So for worry, it's like envisioning the future is amazing. The side effect is then you have to worry about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so the traditional therapy is to say, well, just live for today. And you're like, well, that's a nice thought. It's impossible. You can't live for today if you're a human. Like, more than half our life is spent, what's going to happen? It's like, that's where our life is spent.
Yeah.
So, and I go, well, why would I want to give up my skill because it has a side effect? How about I just give up the side effect? Wouldn't that be nice, right? So that's why I came up with those tools. So overwhelmed happens because we can handle more than one problem at a time.
Yeah.
So I look at my dog, Zoe. She's like 14, rescue dog, right?
Wow.
She's like a
Next
rock.
long life.
She's great, but she never gets overwhelmed because she can only handle one problem at a time. She doesn't say, oh, I got 10 things going on today. What am I going to do? It doesn't happen for her, right? I'm like, there are times when I think she should have written my book because she's really... But here's why. Because she doesn't have the skills.
Yeah.
So she can't envision the future. So she literally can't worry. Like, she can't handle more than one problem at a time. So she literally can't get overwhelmed, right? So when people get overwhelmed, this is what I find. They just have way too much stuff going on. Yeah. So either there's one big giant problem or there's a whole bunch of little problems that have added up. And this is the term I use, is called lumping. And so sometimes I'll do this and my wife's like, you're lumping. I'm like, okay, yeah, sorry. So lumping is when you let all those problems run together. And
Yeah.
as you get all these problems together, and then the pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets to some point where you can't even see the edges.
Yeah.
You have no idea how to attack this thing because it's so giant, like it's just, you just freak out. So I label that overwhelm, but I will tell you, now I'm a doctor, right? So this is how I was trained. When I hear those symptoms, we hear depression.
Yeah.
And we go, oh, you're depressed. And then, oh, so if you're depressed, then here's this medicine that will keep you
Yes.
depressed, right?
Yeah.
What we find is, people feel a little bit better. And then we decide, oh, you must have been chemically imbalanced. And so we gave you this medicine that helped your serotonin level. And so now you're not unbalanced anymore. So you should be good, right?
Yeah.
And then what I find is it doesn't work. And so now I'm watching commercials where, well, if your first antidepressant didn't work, try this other one too. And maybe the combination we could take the mask off and be happy again. I'm like, yeah. I said, maybe we'll just drink alcohol and that will make our depression go away, at least temporarily, right?
Yeah.
And nobody decides you're alcohol deficient when you wake up in the morning, right? It's like, it doesn't, anyway. So when I tell people you're not depressed, you're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It makes it a whole different story, because now they go, oh, you mean I'm not chemically imbalanced? My brain's not broken and I don't have to take a medicine for the rest of my life? You're like, no, you just have to stop being overwhelmed. So the tools that I use, so there's a thing called this. I just use this thing. So think of an S. Okay. And so when you got an S at the bottom, you're feeling in control. You got one problem, two problems, but hey, I can handle that. But then a third problem comes along and there's this very steep slope. So with an S, it goes, and all of a sudden you're at the top of the S. And now you have that third problem, and now you're not in control. Now you're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And then being overwhelmed becomes one of the other problems that you stick up there, right? So what I tell people is like, this is a scary place because basically you're beyond your coping skills. You're like, what am I supposed to do? So if I said, like, if you have $1 million and you're playing golf and you lose 1,000, no big deal.
Yeah.
But if you have $100, you're betting 150 and you lose, okay, now that's a big deal.
That's a big deal.
Or if you have $100 bill, you owe somebody $100 and you only have 50, and then somebody comes along and says, well, you owe me $5 too. And you're like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? I didn't even have enough for the first bill. Never mind. So $5 now becomes this giant deal, right?
Yeah.
So one of the ways to get rid of being overwhelmed, and this came from a friend of mine, is what I call shoe boxes. Okay. So overwhelm comes from lumping. And so trying to compartmentalize, keeping these problems separate, critical. So the more separate you can keep them, the less overwhelmed you come. Because what I find is no one problem is that overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's only when you lump them all together. So shoe boxes is what I want. So if you walked into your bedroom and there were 100 shoe boxes, and the lid was here, and the bottom was there, and the left shoe was there, and the right shoe was there, there's paper, and there was 100 of them, you'd be like, oh, right? They're just thrown all over the place. It's overwhelming, right? But if you walk into that same room, and now there's the boxes there, the lid's on, the left and right's in, the paper's in, and they're all stacked up in the closet, it's the same amount of boxes.
Yeah.
It's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
So that's the key, right? So keeping them compartmentalized and don't lump. When you find it, because people do this. I don't even know why. I do it too. It's like, I got this problem and this problem. Oh yeah, and I forgot I had that problem too.
It's true. We do.
Things to throw on top of the heap. I was like, I don't know why people do that, but they do. And it makes it worse, right?
Yeah, it's like our brain turns into a magnet, attracting more problems, right? That we think. But I want your dog to come and train my dog, because I got to tell you, our dog has the easiest, best life here, but he worries, that dog. He barks when they see, and now he's got to the point where even when it's us coming, no, it's a shepherd, so they're protected, but he's like, rah, rah, rah. I'm like, you know me, like, what is this about? So I wanted to talk to you about guilt and regret, because I think they're kind of two zingers that add to stress for most people. So how can we kind of unburden ourselves of these destructive forces? You got any tips for us on that?
Yeah, I do. So I was listening to you talk the other day, and you were talking about like male, female, and sometimes you're like, I'm not sure I should try to separate them out as much. And I get that, because there's definitely a lot of overlap. There's a lot of men that guilt and a lot of women. Right. But what I find is that guilt and regret are much more, like, I've done some seminars.
Yeah.
And I say, here I go to the group. Okay, write down something that you feel guilty about. And in the group are like writing furiously. They're like, right? And the men are looking at the ceiling going, I guess I could think this, right? So I don't know how if you find that, but that's what I found, right?
I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think this is my feeling, right? That men were designed to hunt woolly mammoths.
Yeah.
So if you're hunting a woolly mammoth, you don't want to think about all the bad things that can happen, or you would never go and hunt,
Yeah.
right? So you tend to minimize. So men in general, not,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
every, because men, there are plenty of men that worry, but
Yeah.
men in general tend to minimize. So why would you feel guilty and regret? Because whatever, right? Women were designed to raise kids. So you got to look for every little thing that might get your kid in trouble. So you're
Yeah.
always looking in the future and trying to find bad things that are going to happen. So you tend to worry more. And then here's what I find is, for whatever reason, they also tend to feel guilty and regret,
Yeah.
but they tend to mix them up. In fact, I was mixing it up when I first started this work. And as I was writing, I was like, wait, guilt and regret are very different things.
Yeah.
So a lot of the women in the group, when I say, what do you feel guilty about? One of the most common things was to say, well, I felt guilty that I didn't spend enough time with my kids.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, okay, that's not really guilt, right? So it turns out there's a difference. So here's a big difference.
Yeah.
So guilt is, I did something wrong. I broke a rule. I ran over the speed limit.
Yeah.
I robbed a bank. I wore white after Labor Day, whatever, right? I mean,
Yeah.
regret is, I made a choice that didn't come out very well.
Yeah.
Right. I had a bad choice.
Yeah.
Very different things.
Yeah.
So what I found was, what they really were saying is that I regretted my choice of spending more time at work and less time with my kids. And so
Yeah.
it's a regret, which is a different process, right? It's a
Yeah.
choice process, as opposed to I broke a rule, because I would say to them, well, did you break rules? And they're like, well, no. Like, but I spent more time. Yeah. See, there's the difference. That's regret, right?
Although, hold on one sec, just before you go on with that, that's so interesting. I've never thought of it that way. And it's interesting for women, I think, and just for our listeners there, if you're thinking, about, because it's sort of both for us, because there is the unwritten social conditioning rule that mothers are supposed to stay with the kids and be the home care. So there is that guilt in the two ways that you've broken that rule, and it's had a negative impact on your kids, the consequence. But I love that distinction between guilt and regret.
That's actually a good point. But it's interesting. I'm just reading this book now about the Nordic theory of everything. I don't know if you've ever read this, not.
No.
But it's basically, it's a lady who lived in Finland who came to the United States to marry her husband. And at first, in Finland, America's like, oh, it's this wonderful place. And then she got here, it's like, it's not that wonderful. It's like, there's a lot of things going on here that don't happen in Finland that we don't even think about. Childcare is one of them, right? So in Finland, there's a national program for childcare. So women have no guilt about working because their kids are being taken care of by
Hallelujah.
free, good quality childcare. And it's like, so they lose that guilt because the government has said, we think that it's so important for kids to grow up healthy that we're going to provide this as a service.
Yeah.
And it also helps women because then they don't have, and she says, like in America, she hears these stories of these super moms, that work like 80 hours a week and take care of their kids and then clean the house. And you're like, wait, yeah, that's a little crazy, right? Like women's liberation that just added more things to their plate to do, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. And funny when you're saying about the woolly mammoth and that, absolutely. I love that distinction about the gatherers and the hunters. And tied to that, I think sort of layered onto that as well, you get the fact that young girls from a really young age are conditioned to be people pleasers, right? So so I think women get the double whammy about feeling that guilt and regret more because we're supposed to people please, whereas our young boys from a young age have much less of that put on them. So there gets to be more entitlement, right? In a certain way to live. So anyhow, sorry, I cut you off about you were heading to the solution for us.
Yeah. So it's not worth it. Well, I mean, so somebody had said to me, like, you said this before, you have to have awareness of what's going on. Then you have to get educated. And then you need to take action. So the awareness and the education are like, hey, guilt and regret are different things. So guilt is I broke a rule. And regret is I made a bad choice. But they have a lot of similarities. So they're both things that happened in the past and you can't change them. They already happened. Like I can't go back and spend more time with my kids because they're already grown up, right? So it's already done. Or if I talk in my book about, I bought a computer system and at the time it was a great decision. But then later on, the lady who was my office manager who had advocated for the system quit. And now I was stuck with this computer system that nobody knew how to use. And it was like, so now it looked like a bad decision. So I could have gone back and regret and go, oh, what was I thinking? Right.
Yeah.
So what I do then is say, okay, look, so if we're talking about guilt, then you broke a rule. You
Yeah.
did, and it could be a written rule, it could be a law, it could
Yeah.
be an unwritten rule, like what you were just saying. It's
Yeah.
like, women are supposed to be this, and
Yeah.
you're not doing that, so you're breaking this, social rule that's not
Yeah.
written down anywhere. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's there. I hadn't really thought about it like that, but you're
Yeah.
right. It's there. And so the rules are set up. So, okay. So a couple different things. So one of the things is like, you have to identify what's right and wrong. And maybe this is where this comes in. So you have to identify what group you're in. You have to identify what the goal of the group is. You have to identify what the rule is. And then you have to decide who is going to be a judge. And it's
Yeah.
like, when you start doing that, then you go, whoa, okay. So now it goes, okay, well, maybe I need to change groups. Maybe I should be in a different group.
I
Maybe
love that.
instead of being in a Republican group, I should be in a Democratic
Yeah.
group or whatever. I should change churches or whatever. So that's one thing. Two is you can change the rule and you can say, you
Yeah.
know what? I don't like that rule. I'm going to change the rule. And that's
Yeah.
not easy, but it's certainly possible. And you
Yeah.
see this all the time. Our rules have been set up to be malleable
Yeah.
them, and they do over time. So I think what you were saying was very true 50 years ago. I think it's less true now.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that who gets to judge. That as you said that, it just kind of hit me over the head. That is such a powerful shift.
Well, and yeah, so that's because that's the other thing. Like in my story about the computer, I was like, well, who gets to judge? Do I judge? Do my staff judge? My
Yeah.
staff were really upset with me. And I'm like, well, you don't get to judge. And it's like, right.
Yeah.
It's like you get to decide. And what we have done is we've made judges and say, okay, you're the Supreme Court, you're a federal judge. And we've said to them, we are going to give you the power. Then when it comes down to there's a question about right and wrong, we're going to tell you, you're going to be given the power to say, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
And so that's why we put our judges at these high standards, because we're giving them a lot of power.
Yeah.
Now, so what I found though is guilt. Like I'm not an advocate to getting rid of guilt, because guilt is crazy important for a society to function. It's the stick that we use to get people to do what we want them to do. Right. So I'm not trying to get rid of guilt, but what I find is many people beat themselves up forever over some small infraction. Like they did some small thing and then they beat themselves up forever. You're like, so if guilt is designed to get us to change our behavior and do something different, and you do that, then you don't need to feel guilty anymore. Guilt did what it was supposed to do. So stop beating yourself up.
Yeah. I like that. And it's interesting because I find it's that external versus internal, right? And that's why I really love that who gets to judge, both at the macro level, as you were saying, in terms of our Supreme Courts or whatever, but even at that micro level, right? And am I going to allow, for kids in high school, am I going to allow my peers, or as you get older, our coworkers, as opposed to having that unshakable internal sort of thermometer, if you will. And that sort of leads us nicely to self-esteem. I know you do a lot of work about that, and self-esteem matters on the road to happiness, as sort of per your book, but even showing up in negotiations as you're more powerful. Talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I talk about is finding our happy place. And once I identify what the happy place is, then I go, well, what's keeping us from being a happy place? To be honest with you, I think we're all meant to live in our happy place.
Yeah.
But then there's these things that get in the way, and that's where these stresses are coming from. The worry, the guilt, the regret, the low self-esteem, the being overwhelmed. And those are the things that are roadblocks that are keeping us from staying in our happy place. And self-esteem is probably the most critical one.
Yeah.
Because it's so basic. It's so internal. It started it started the day we figured out we were different than our mom.
Yeah.
Right. So our brain isn't really working that great at that point, but it's working enough to say, hey, I'm different than my mom. And you now start going, hey, am I a good person or not?
Yeah.
And you're like, so your self-esteem is already being developed by the time you figure out you're 5 and 6 and you go, oh yeah, that's me. Right. So it's like, now when you're 35 and you're trying to change what happened when you were 1 or when you're 5, it's like, wow, like it becomes difficult to say the least. Right.
Yeah.
But what I realized was there's actually 3 components to self-esteem. So there's self-worth, like, hey, am I a good person or not?
Yeah.
That's the answer to that question. Am I a good person? 2 is self-respect. And self-respect is, am I doing things the right way? And I think when I was listening to you, you said you came in as a bully in the beginning, and a barracuda, I think was the word you used, right? And you liked that at first, but then you realize, whoa, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's the right way to do it, right? So self-respect has to do, am I doing it the right way? And I think you came to the conclusion that maybe not, right?
Yeah.
Then the third one is called self-efficacy, or I call it confidence. And it's like, hey, how am I going to do with a future test? So somebody said, hey, take a test on this book or learn how to play pickleball. This is my wife's learning how to play pickleball, right? And it's like, how good am I going to be at that? Right. And so those three things become the components of self-esteem. And here's what I find. It's interesting. Like self-esteem gets started when you're little, so you don't even know what's going on. So the people around you are establishing your self-esteem, and they don't even know it probably, right?
Yeah.
So if you come to the conclusion that you're not worthy, or that you're not very confident, then there's a part of our brain, and I call it the 4Ds, and that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
So I see patients that have, or clients, that my wife now says, you have to say clients because I've retired as a doctor. So people go, okay, I have this in my head, I have low self-esteem. And so something comes along and says, hey, you're a really great guy. And you go, wait, that doesn't fit. It causes dissonance. And so then you try to adjust the information to fit, and you go, oh, they didn't know what they were talking about. If they knew the real me. Wait, what did you say? No, let's just talk about the weather. Oh, you must have some other reason for bringing that up. And so now what happens is you have low self-esteem, and somebody gives you evidence that it should be good, and you ignore it.
Yeah.
And then somebody comes along and says, you're really crappy. And you're like, ugh, I don't like hearing that, but it fits. You're right. And so how do you get out of that trap when all you're doing is only hearing the bad stuff and not hearing the good stuff? And here's what happens. So if you have good self-esteem, then it flips around. Then when somebody says you did something bad, you're like, what? You don't know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so it works the other way too.
Yeah.
So like I have a client right now that I'm working with, and I go, look, you have a big, giant part of you. There's a big track in your brain that says, I'm not worthy.
Yeah.
But there's a small little track down there that says I am worthy. So what we're doing is working on feeding that part. And then as I feed this part, as he feeds this part, then this part will just shrink down and get shriveled up and get overgrown and get rusty, and it won't work very well. And as we grow this part, now then the switches, the positive feedback switches. And now you're thinking, oh yeah, look, there's another instance where I'm working.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens, and this is interesting, is like, because my wife does this all the time. So she'll do something good and give herself 1 point, maybe 0 points, because she goes, well, I was supposed to do that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even count. But then something doesn't go right, and she's giving herself -10.
Yeah.
So if you get a -10 for everything that doesn't go right, you get 0 or 1 for everything that goes well. That's a hard number to keep up with, right?
Yeah.
So here's what I say to her, like, honey, when you wake up in the morning, you should get 50 points. And she's like, what? And I go, well, you stayed alive, yay, because I've heard you say that, right? I woke up, yay, 10 points, right? There's water, I got food, that's 10, that's 20. My wife is safe, and my house is safe. So I'm up to 50 points, and it doesn't even, I just open my eyes, like, what? How great is that? But here's the cool part. So when you do that, when you keep track accurately, and that's what I say, if you're going to give yourself 10 points for negative things, and give yourself 10 for positive, and make sure you count everything. So I had one of my patients write down all the good things that happened in the day. About halfway through the day, he called me, I'm not doing this anymore. And I go, why not? He goes, it's too hard. Like, I have to write too many stuff down. I'm like,
that's great.
Because we have a crazy amount of good things. My car started today. Oh, my shirt fit, right? It's like all the stuff that we take for granted.
Yeah. And
So
women are particularly bad for that, because we don't receive well, right? Like even compliments, it's like, oh, this little thing. So we're constantly pushing them away and not allowing ourselves to build up.
So when someone has 50 points when they wake up, and somebody goes, hey, I got this thing, and if you succeed, you get 20 points. And you're like, why not? And then, oh, but if you don't succeed, you get -20. You're like, oh, well, I'll still be at +30, whatever.
Yeah.
But if you start out the morning waking up going, ugh, I'm here for another day. Start out at -10. Somebody goes, hey, you can do this thing for 20 points. And you're like, oh, ooh, that would put me at +10. That would make me feel good. And they go, yeah, but if you don't do it, then you'll be -30. And they're like, oh, you know what? I think I'll just stick with -10. So you're much less likely to take a chance. Yeah. Because you're starting out in a negative place to begin with. Who wants to be even more negative?
Yeah. So important. And self-esteem is so important when you show up for negotiations, right? I mean, in negotiating your life and negotiating with your kids, your intimate partner, in business. I mean, it is so important. And actually, just circling back, speaking of negotiation, do you have any tools you'd suggest to help lower stress before you go into a negotiation, again, whether personally or professionally?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned prepared. So be
Yeah.
prepared. Like what I find is when I'm doing a speech or like I'm working on a TED talk myself,
Yeah.
right? And it's
No, it
like
can
by
help.
preparing, like then your
Yeah.
anxiety and your concern
Yeah.
about failing goes
Yeah.
way down. So the
Yeah.
more prepared you are, the better off you're going to be. And I think you talked about, and I've read it in other books, again, Getting to Yes or whatever. And it's like, the more prepared, the more you know what you're doing and the
Yeah.
more you know where they're coming from, like empathy. If I
Yeah.
know where they're coming from, that makes everything so much better.
Yeah.
But then there's specific things like, so I was just at the dentist the other day and I'm laying there and they're drilling on my tooth. And I'm like, and I'm thinking, I'm the less stressed doc. I should be real relaxed here, right? And I'm like, and then I looked at myself and I'm like, wait, no, like I'm tight, right? So I
Yeah.
started doing some deep breathing exercises.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, and then I fell asleep.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like
Too good at it.
so relaxation techniques, deep breathing
Yeah.
techniques, mindfulness, they're all things that work,
Yeah.
but they work even better when they know what it is that you're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
So when you can sense what's going on inside of you, and you
Yeah.
can, like, I didn't realize I was intense until I started looking around. I go, whoa, yeah,
Yeah.
like I can feel it. And when I relax, you could say, oh, there it was. I was tense because now I'm relaxed
Yeah.
and I can feel the difference, right?
Yeah. It's funny with breathing. You think about it was back in the day, everybody considered all so woo-woo when the, so-called hippies were talking about it. And now the science has caught up and everybody's like, oh,
Oh,
this
yeah.
actually works.
Right. But here's what I found. Like if like there's a so yoga, all this like yoga, breathing, it's I don't know how to say it. It's Qigong, what I
Oh,
say
yeah, Qigong.
Qigong. There you go. Yeah, they all work, but they work even better when you know what it is you're trying to work
Yeah.
with. So if you
Yeah.
understand what worry is, if you understand what self-esteem is, if you understand what being overwhelmed
Yeah.
is, well, then the techniques work even better because
Yeah.
now you know what it is. Now it's not just some generic thing you're doing. Now it's
Yeah.
something that I'm doing with a purpose. And so it makes it more effective. But one of
Smart.
the things I was going to say about self-esteem is it's not all about self. And
Hmm.
you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens is we label ourselves and we say, okay, like I'm bald, which I had to get used to, by the way. Yeah, I dressed up for Halloween as Pitbull, the singer. And so I shaved my head. And my wife's like, you're not going to shave your head. And I like, yes, I am. And
Oh, good for
so I
you.
shaved it. And she's like, oh, kind of like it. So then it stayed, right?
Oh, that's cool.
Right. But the first patient said, somebody was asking who his doctor was. And they said, oh, yeah, my doctor's the bald doctor. And I'm like, who's, oh, that's me. Yeah, right. Yeah. So we have all these labels. So I'm a doctor, I'm a
Yeah.
father, I'm a husband, right? I'm a son, I'm a brother, right? I play basketball, I do karaoke, right? So I have all these labels, but the labels come with good and bad. But
Yeah.
who gives them the good and bad? Our society.
Yeah.
So our society, and this I don't like this, but when we see people who are overweight, like as a doctor, I say, okay, you're not healthy. But as
Yeah.
a society, we go, oh, we don't like that.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily the person, oh, you look horrible. What the hell's the matter with you? Go lose some weight. But what we do say is when they lose weight, we're like, oh, you look wonderful. Well, like
Yeah.
what? Did I not look wonderful when I
Yeah.
was over, right? Like it's like
Yeah.
so we give them that message that being overweight is not a good thing to be.
Yeah.
And so self-esteem, the group has a lot of say in our self-esteem
Yeah.
because it says it has a lot of weight in what we think is valuable and what we think is not
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that gets back to what we were saying before about that
Yeah.
external and inter. How much are you going to let that external judging
Yes.
affect how you
I
show up?
put there's a meter in our head that goes
Yeah,
group
it's
versus me,
true.
right? And so
Yeah.
I find myself, and I think you're right with women, is that they tend to be on that group side. So they tend to listen to what other people are saying
Yeah.
and give them more credibility than they give themselves.
Yeah.
And so I see like women that have been in an abusive relationship and they're
Yeah.
like, my husband thinks I'm a this or that. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
don't give him that credibility.
Yeah. Don't give
Like
them that
think of him as
power.
a
Yeah.
2-year-old. If the 2-year-old said you don't look good, would you go, oh, 2-year-old, you're really right? And oh my God,
Yeah.
I'm really no, you would go, you're just a 2-year-old. What do you know? Right.
Yeah.
And so when you give people that power over you,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a good place to be.
Yeah. Now we've
And it,
mentioned your book, Highway to Your Happy Place.
yes.
What were you, I guess, what were your hopes about what people would get out of it, Gary?
Well, here's what I've been finding. I tend to use this in my final statement, which is so I would say to people like if you I would say I'm writing this book on how to have less stress. And they go, oh, I need that book. That'd be great. I'm like, well, that's good. I said, but there's 1,000 other books out there. Have you gotten any of them? And what I see is people are so overwhelmed and so anxious. And this is what I see is they resign themselves to this is the way it's got to be. There's no way out.
Yeah.
The thing that I say to them is like, I don't care if you, I mean, I would like you to get my book, right? Because I think it's good, but get something, do
Yeah.
something. Stop being like, the word we use is learned helplessness. It's
Yeah.
like, it's just the way it
Oh,
is. There's nothing I can do about it. And
yes.
you're like, no, do not resign yourself to being stressed out the rest of your life. There are ways to change it. Part of the way is to understand where stresses are coming from. Part is to understand that you have some control over the situation. Even if it's 5% control, that's
Yeah.
better than 0% control.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. And
Learned
so, yeah,
helplessness.
so my goal then is to get this book in people's hands in whatever format. So I've
Yeah.
done online courses and audiobooks and blogs and
Yeah.
podcasts, because if I can get the information to people and say, look, don't give up. There's a way to make this better. You just got to find it, right? You just
Yeah.
got to find the right key and it'll get unlocked.
I love that. What was one of the most surprising things that you discovered while you were researching for your book?
Well, a lot of surprising things. Yeah. It's like, well, like the first thing we talked about earlier was that regret and guilt are different things.
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
hadn't really read that. I'm like, wait, what? That's
Yeah.
really different, right? And
Yeah.
that like, self-esteem was made up of different components. Here's the other one. And one of my friends who had read the book said the same thing. She goes, huh, one of the chapters in the book is on boredom. And she goes, wait, I hadn't really thought of boredom as that bad. I'm like, are you kidding me? Boredom is probably the worst thing that's out there.
Yeah.
Like when we send somebody to prison for murder and they mess up in prison, what do?
Yeah.
We put them in solitary confinement,
Yeah.
which is boredom. And
Yeah.
it's like it like literally drives people crazy.
Yeah.
And in the book I write about when I was 16, riding around in a parking lot with a bunch of guys, hoping that something would happen
Yeah.
because we were bored. And people do crazy things not
You
to feel
went.
bored.
That
So
is true.
boredom is bad. It's really bad. And so like I had to realize that boredom that's why I put it in the book, because it's like, no, this is bad. And it's bad because we don't even realize how bad it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, everybody, you're going to have to go check out that book
Oh
and
yeah.
find your happy place. So I normally like to end, Gary, by asking what's one of the greatest mindset shifts you've ever had? And it doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about at all. It could be just one of those things that makes you suddenly see things differently or show up differently.
Yeah. Well, so as a physician, there was a change in the weather, right? The pendulum swung. And we
Yeah.
went from, hey, you guys aren't treating chronic pain enough to, oh, now you're making everybody an addict. And
Uh,
I got caught up in that pendulum swing. And so the
yeah.
board was investigating me. And at some point, they actually suspended my license for a month. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm
Well,
I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I'm sitting on the couch in my underwear, drinking a beer, watching
yeah.
reruns of Shrek, asking my wife to get me another beer, right? And I'm like, this isn't good. And what
Yeah.
I realized was that I had to change no, I had to be willing to change my identity.
Uh,
Because up until that time, I was a doctor.
yeah.
But then I realized, hey, you know what? Somewhere along the line, I'm not going to be allowed to be a doctor. Either I'm going to
Yeah.
retire or something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I got to find another identity. And I see this with athletes all the time. They've been a basketball player for 30 years. And at 35,
Yeah.
they can't be a basketball player anymore. So
Yeah.
now what do they do? And it's
Yeah.
like, so, and I see this, that's just, I see this with other people who have been something and now they're not that. And they have to
Yeah.
go out and they get sick or they can't do this anymore,
Yeah.
whatever. And so being able to change your identity was amazing. That helped a lot. So then I became an author and
Yeah.
a property investor and a karaoke
Yeah.
singer and a basketball player. And so now I have all these other identities. So when I retired, people are like, how's your retirement? I'm like, it's good,
Yeah.
because I'd already gone through the process
Yeah.
having other identities.
Oh, that's important. That's such a great wake up call. 'Cause as you were saying that, Gary, it reminded me, like my husband used to be in the trades, and when you'd get the pension statements would come through, and then I started looking into it. It is staggering how many people die within a very short period of time after retirement when they've had an entire career with a particular identity as a tradesperson or as whatever, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
I love what you're putting out
Yeah,
there. So
absolutely.
where can people learn more about you?
So, so I have a website. It's called thelessdresseddoc.com. And then I have an email that's thelessdresseddoc@gmail.com. Those places. Yeah.
Perfect.
So I just changed it. Well, I'm just in the process of fixing the website. So it's going to look awesome when it comes online. So,
Nice. Nice. You
yeah,
and
but
me
then I
both.
have an audio book coming out for people that don't want to actually read the book. They want to listen to it in their car or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's coming out soon. And then I did an online course that I just watched the other day, and I'm watching myself. I'm like, oh, look at me, right? And it's like, but it was actually really good. And the editor just emailed me today. He goes, yeah, I really liked it too. I really got a lot out of it. I was like, yeah, I like that. I said, you're editing all these online courses. You must be really smart by now.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we'll make sure to put that all in the show notes as well. And thank you so much, Gary, for sharing your time with us and all of these insights. The timing, it could not be more perfect. Important message. And thanks for sharing with us.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Have me come back. We'll talk about some more stuff, right?
Absolutely. We got loads. We barely scratched the surface
Yes,
here.
absolutely.
So we'll have to do a part 2 for sure. So for our listeners there, I hope you got lots of value from this. Make sure to give the gift of sharing, as I always say as well. I mean, my goodness, we all need to find that path to happiness in these days. So make sure that you are sharing this information with others. Subscribe if you have not done that yet. And before we sign off today, just a few ways that we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills so you can negotiate your best life. I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind or VIP experiences that'll help you better leverage your power so you can get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com and make sure to grab a copy of my book by the same name, Art of Feminine Negotiation. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, as always, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.